Before I introduce my friend Darcy Harris, I want to take a second to say something about last night began Passover. Passover, for those of you who are Jewish or who know Jewish people, know that Passover has to do with freedom. And I couldn't help but think about the people in Myanmar who are struggling for their freedom. So 5,000 years ago, people struggled and they're still struggling. Darcy, thank you for making it here this morning. I met, Pat and I met Darcy at Upaya. I think the first time was for an 8-day Being with Dying course, which was pretty intense, Darcy and Brad, who you're going to meet, her husband, who you're going to meet in a couple of weeks, really stood out for me as real pure hearts. And then we met again, I think, at, I think you were there at the Grace course with us too. Yes, so we've had some time together, and Pat and I really want to go visit them. And we were actually thinking about it, and then COVID got in the way. So hopefully we're going to do it. So Darcy is, as many of you probably read, is a professor of thanatology at King's College in Hamilton? No, London, Ontario. London is near Hamilton, relatively speaking. And she deals with issues of grief and dying, grief, compassion, issues of life, right? And she's going to be talking to us in her own special way today about those things. Thank you so much, Darcy, for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, Mark. It's a privilege. Because I am an academic, you guys are going to see slides. I don't like seeing my face staring back at me at the screen. I find that disconcerting. So it's much easier for me to do slides. So I'm going to go ahead and oh, it says the host is disabled screen sharing. Can somebody please help me with that while I'm getting ready? Thank you. So, and yeah, I'm originally from Florida. All my family is there. I have not seen my 95-year-old father now in a year and a half. And I know most of us in here are dealing with these issues, and these are losses as well as death losses. Am I good now?
You should be good.
I am. I see it. Thank you. All right. And I go through this. There we go. So I was trying to think of what might be most helpful and offering a talk a little bit about grief and how we approach grief and how we think about grief. So I've sort of meshed a few things together, and hopefully they will be helpful for you at this time. I always start with this picture because to me, this is the essence of grief. When we experience something in our lives that we know we can never go back again, that somehow it's different, that life is going to be fundamentally changed for us in some way, shape, or form. This is how I look at grief. So this is the pane of glass. And in this situation, you could go back with really good glue and try to paste back these pieces, but it would never look the same as the full pane of glass that it once was. So I always keep this in mind, and I'm always looking for where is the glass shattered? That's kind of my image of grief and loss. I also would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about what's in front of us right now. And in the United States alone, you're almost at 550,000 deaths. I think it's 548,000 something. It's just humongous. It's just unfathomable to imagine that much death, loss, and then grief. This is a conservative number that for every person who dies, there are at least 5 people bereaved. Most of the work I've been reading is saying 9 people, but I'm going conservative. So if you multiply 550,000 times 5, that's how many people right now are experiencing profound grief and loss as a result of COVID-19 in the United States. That's not insignificant. We're also looking at what we call the tsunami of difficult grief, that we feel grief is, and I say we, those of us who work in this field, grief is an adaptive process. It's a part of being human. but we're looking at deaths of people who it happens suddenly. You can't be with your loved ones. It's under circumstances that are very difficult. You can't gather together for funerals in the way that you might have. So we're looking at lots of factors that are going to complicate the grieving process, in addition to feeling powerless and helpless. So I think it also occurs in a backdrop of many other types of losses, with losses related to our just living our lives. And we're all dealing with that in different ways, but it's certainly the glass has shattered for many of us, and probably for most. And I think what most of us are feeling is that the scope of the needs associated with the pandemic globally as well as locally are going to be immense, just intense, potentially overwhelming. Stories of people who've lost their businesses, people who can't see loved ones, things that happen that we can't control, precarious employment, just the list goes on. I'm not repeating anything you don't already know. So I tend to look at loss as three major areas that we would focus on, and remember that grief is not just because a loved one has died. Maybe grief is because something inside of us dies, or our hopes, or our health, or a relationship. So we have to look at grief in a much broader picture. So I look at relationships, and of course relationships right now are profoundly affected, but the loss of connection is huge for many people right now. The financial uncertainty and precariousness that occurs right now related to people having to close up businesses, people having to modify how they do their work, and people losing their jobs because of the pandemic is huge. And of course, the loss of health. And I'm not talking just about physical health related to COVID. We're seeing a surge now in mental health concerns, increased use of substances to cope, people trying to find ways to deal with the isolation. And so mental health is part of this picture as well. And I'll just, because I'm an academic, we define everything ad nauseum, but I think it's important. What is grief? And grief is not a diagnosis. It's not a pathology. If anything, grief is probably what makes us more human. It's what combines us and connects us with each other, and that we experience grief. And it's a normal and a natural reaction to loss. So grief helps us in many ways, even though it's painful. I think we're conditioned to think that because something is painful and we suffer, that means it's wrong, or it's because we're unskilled. But in this situation, the pain of the grief is actually the working of the grieving process. Our understandings of grief have really changed just in the last 15, 20 years. So I always smile. People always know Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And we now know that grief doesn't unfold in this way. There are no stages, and there's no predictability about grief. And that's what makes it really hard too. You never know. And if you've had a significant loss in your life, you know you carry that loss with you in many different ways. In some ways have made you stronger, in some ways have shown your own resilience. And in other ways, you also know your own vulnerability and your own humanity as well. So we know that all types of loss experiences can trigger grief. We also recognize that grief is subjective, that what I might experience as a loss may not be the same as what another person might experience as a loss. So it's really important to listen, and to listen as people describe their experiences, because they're telling you if this is a loss for them or not. And I'll go back that just because they're painful doesn't mean something is wrong. Where I start with identifying grief is all of us have a way of seeing the world. We grew up with a view of the world. This is what our parents instilled in us, or our family systems, and how we grew up. It's how we see things. It's how we interpret events. It's how kind of things make sense to us. And it helps us to have a sense of predictability, that we get up in the morning and have our cup of coffee and don't really think about what happens if a bus hits me today, because that we experience the world and we don't expect that. And that helps us to get through our day and to make plans and to function, frankly. And so these are things that are established when we were really young, these sense of how the world should be, how other people might be. And they're tied into what we call our attachment system, which is a very early way of forming our view of the world. And they're both related kind of like that. So it's really how we expect the world to work, our sense of justice, how we assume other people would basically be, and how we tend to think of ourselves as well. So it includes how we might find safety. If for those of us who remember 9/11, I realize most of my students were in diapers now when 9/11 happened, so I can't do this with my students, a lot of them. But for most of us who did experience 9/11, if you can think about the first thing you did after you realized what was happening, I would say the majority of us either walked next door to somebody to talk about this, we called somebody we loved, we reached out, and that's an attachment behavior. And that's part of how we feel safe in the world, is we're going through this together. We connect with people we love to make sure they're okay, and to find our own secure base again. This is the second one, is how we believe the world should work, and why events happen. That's our sense of justice. We think of, this shouldn't happen here, or why did this happen? That's hitting on our assumptive world that assumes that the world should be a certain way, and when it's not, we question. We're not sure what to do with that. And then how we see ourselves and how we fit in with our social network, of people, our roles, our identities, those things that are very fluid, but they're still very much present, and how we see ourselves within that particular world. So what happens in grief is that those assumptions we have about the world get shattered in some way, shape, or form. So this causes us to go into a place of great disequilibrium where it's really disruptive. And we have to sort of learn to relearn our assumptive world now, based on what we've experienced, based upon what we were taught or what we might have learned when we were younger. And we can do that, but it's a painful process, and that process is grief. So this is what triggers the grief response, is somehow the loss of our assumptive world, these shattered pieces of how we see the world. That's what triggers our grief. So one of the areas I'm working in right now is political grief. And even though I live in Canada, I'm from the United States, I also see globally the changes that are happening. And I see what I call political grief, and what's going on in the world. And so I see this as the grief response being triggered to what we had been brought up, or to what we intrinsically feel as right to be a human being. So this is just another way of looking at it. It's the process, by which we take the world that we now know to exist, that's happened, with the world we once believed to exist. So an example might be when I was younger and I was married, my first marriage, I said my vows. I meant those vows. I truly believed that we would be together forever. So 12 years later, when I was in divorce court, this was not the world that I thought I was going to be experiencing. This certainly did not reconcile with who I thought I was. And yet here was life, here was it happening. And so there was a huge grieving process over the world I thought was going to be in place versus the reality I was now living. You can find these little pieces and these big pieces in our lives, and they shape and form a lot of who we are and how we react and how we interact with others. I always put this up. This is M.C. Escher, for those of you who aren't familiar. He's done some beautifully convoluted etchings and pictures. And I love this picture, because if you look at how is grief experienced, well, this is about how grief is experienced by most people. There's no rhyme or reason. You never know what's going to come up. There's no semblance of order to it. And you feel like you're going in the same line over and over. And that's normal grief. So as I said earlier, there's theories that might propose stages, phases, tasks. People really want to kind of get grief nailed down. And it's hard because it's not possible. If you could nail down the human condition, you've got grief. And so it's impossible to do that. And there's no way to neatly package the grief experience. Most of us in our session have experienced profound losses and grief, and we know, as much as we really wanted it to be in some form of progression, that's not how it works. So these are the kinds of theories that are really pervasive in our popular culture. You'll see them all around, and I think it's because we have this appeal to wanting things to be explained. We have this appeal to wanting things to be in a certain order. And it's really window dressing. It's not describing the actual experience of grief. So I think grief is really, it's the ultimate life lesson that teaches us about impermanence. And it doesn't mean that if we grieve, we haven't understood impermanence or the nature of things. It just means that we go through this experience because we are here right now, and this is part of that experience. To the right, I'm going to just draw your attention to this visual. I really like it. It's from the Bereaved Families of Canada logo. And if you'll notice, this is a family where a child has died. And you'll see the child that has died is still with the family. Even though the child is physically not there, that child will always be there in the hearts and the memories and the minds of that family and a part of that family. So for a long time, we assumed you had to work through grief, and that the purpose of grief was so you could let go of the lost person and disengage. And it was assumed that you had to emote and you had to talk about it and you had to do this work of grief. And in the last 10, 15 years, the research has shown that's not necessarily true. And actually the opposite is really true. And this is what a lot of the work I do in my clinical practice is normalizing this. So when I was in training for my nursing and then for my counseling, the goal of grief seemed to be to get people to emote. You know, you feel a lot better if you let it out. And the recent research doesn't really support that in some places, people who don't necessarily grieve with their emotions, if you push them to go there, you might actually cause more harm. So what you do when somebody's really grieving is you listen, you follow their lead, and you kind of wait to see what they seem to need and what they want versus assuming that you know what they need to do. And actually the research is that in some programs that have mandated bereavement counseling for someone who's had a certain type of loss, or to put somebody into a grief group when that's not what they really want to do, or to push somebody into counseling, if that's not really the way they work, it could cause more harm than good. So we're careful now in how we look at grief. One of my colleagues talked about hunger and grief because they're both part of human experience. They're both part of being here, that we experience hunger. And you don't treat hunger with food. You eat because it's part of what we need to do. And the same thing with grief. We don't treat grief. We actually support grief because grief is also something that's healthy and that helps us, and not something we want to try to push away and dismiss, even though it's hard and painful and highly inconvenient for some people. I think the continuing bonds, this is the research that came in the mid-90s and has been built upon since that time. And this really debunked that myth that you need to let go of the lost person in order to move on. And the saying is, death ends a life, but not a relationship. How many people do we know who have lost a loved one that they still feel their sense of presence? They have dreams about them. They have sometimes a sense of what they would say to them or that they're guiding them. They go regularly maybe to the gravesite because they feel a sense of connection there. And that's all healthy grief. That's all part of grief. So often with my clients, I try to find ways to help them reconnect with the person they've lost or the people they've lost versus trying to move on and forget about that. Because I think once you find a way to carry that person with you in a way that makes sense to you and that's meaningful, you can move forward once you've been able to do that. So the goal of grief isn't to get over it or to recover from it or to resolve the loss. You know, the goal is to let grief do its work and to honor that relationship and honor that person in your life. And if it was a difficult person, a person that you had conflict or a person that was abusive or troubling to you, you can use this also as a way to continue to work through those relationship issues to resolve some of your own pain from the relationship itself. Just because a person dies doesn't mean that you can't continue in that work related to somebody who was really difficult to you. I put this up here. It's a really nice kind of technical slide, but I really like it because this is research from a group of people in the Netherlands, the Utrecht University. And this is a huge study that's been replicated several times. And what we know about grief is that most people don't stay in grief all the time, that sometimes you feel the heaviness of the grief and then you have to go pay the bills. You have a memory that you just stops you in your tracks. And then somebody will invite you for dinner, and you actually might enjoy yourself in the distraction of getting away. So what we find is that most people, what they call, oscillate between feeling the loss and the heavy weight of the grief and being able to also get out of it or to distract a little bit, and maybe do things that take them away from the grief, and then they come back. And most people kind of go back and forth in their grief in a very regular way. So there's a lot of work now on what we call meaning making, and it's considered the main process of grief. And this isn't a cognitive thing. This is a real gut sense of, now what? You'll have people asking the why question, especially when there was intentionality, a suicide, a murder, a natural disaster that maybe people feel could have been prevented. So it's that sense of, why did this happen, which is a question that can never really fully be answered. But the meaning making part of that is, okay, now what? Now what do I do? Now how do I see the world? How do I move forward now, knowing what I know or experiencing what I've experienced or doubled over with this pain that I've had? And sometimes people find meaning in very different ways. You'll hear people talk about signs and symbols, or you'll hear people choose to engage in a cause or a choice, a legacy work that they know would honor that person, or that actually kind of is an extension of their relationship with that person. This is how Mothers Against Drunk Driving got started. This is also how, I don't remember, years and years ago, Adam Walsh was a young child who was murdered brutally in Florida. He was 6 years old, and his father formed, I can't remember, it's not America's Most Wanted, but he formed this national organization to help with crime prevention and unresolved crimes, to use people to help resolve those types of crimes and to rotate in. And it was a really big watched show, but this was his way of honoring his son and of making sure hopefully no other parent would have to go through what he did. That was his meaning making. So it's different for each person. I did have one client who had a very conflicted relationship with her mother, and her mother was very controlling to her. And after her mother died, her sisters gave her one of her mother's nice suits to wear. And she said, I can't put this on. It's like, wrapping myself in my mother. And what she chose to do was a ritual where she didn't rip the suit. She actually took a seam ripper and removed all the seams, and she did it carefully by dismembering that. But then she buried it in a garden with an angel over it, because she said, I don't want to wish my mother harm, but I don't want her to continue to be able to harm me even after she's gone. This is another piece that we really struggle with in terms of our social rules. And I could have not put this slide up, and I could have asked people in the room, what are the messages that bereaved people get? And you would have named them all. So the social rules about how long grief should last, and you get anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months to a year. Certainly after a year, people are expected to be well on their way to resuming life. And for many people, the first year they spend in numbness. The first year is spent really dealing with all of the practicalities and just kind of trying to put one foot in front of the other. And the second year is when the emotion and the real impact of it kind of hits them. So there's really no sense of how long grief should last. The rule now too is that we will always, if we have a significant loss, we will always grieve that loss. If you've lost a child, you will always have that sense of loss. My mother died, it was maybe 25, 26 years ago, around Easter. When I start seeing Easter lilies, I have a visceral response. It's a funny thing. I don't even know of it in my mind. I feel my body. And then when I tune in, I realize, oh yeah, it's Easter. She died on a Good Friday. So this is 25 years later. Who has the right to grieve a loss? Well, you didn't know them very well. You weren't married. Oh, you never held that baby in your arms for a miscarriage. There's lots of rules around who has the right to grieve a loss. And none of these really matter, because you grieve because you grieve. If the loss is recognized as valid or not. So the death of a pet might for some people be a huge loss. My first bereaved client actually was the death of her dog. And this dog was her only companion, the one who stayed with her, who loved her unconditionally. And her family was all saying, oh, mom, just, get over it. It's just a dog. We can get you another one. Because they didn't recognize how significant this loss was. If the relationship's considered significant enough. So maybe you were boyfriend, girlfriend, but you weren't married. So, the grief goes and recognized to the parents, but not necessarily to the person who was really the partner to that individual who died. There's lots of these rules. And then how grief should be expressed, especially along gender lines. I often find are women who don't grieve through their emotions, but maybe who grieve through their actions, and men who do grieve through their emotions, who need to talk about their feelings. These are the two most common presentations in my practice of people who struggle because they're not getting support. They're getting a lot of messaging that they're grieving wrong, and they really need to kind of do something different. So I think, healthy grief struggles with unhealthy social expectations. And we live in a capitalistic society, a market-driven society, really engaged with being efficient and, being consumers. And that really is the lens through how most of our experiences are judged. So, if you're grieving, you're not necessarily very productive. You're also maybe more emotional. You're experiencing deep emotions. And we're not comfortable with that because emotions are, as one of my clients did say, this is really inconvenient, which I quoted earlier. And she was a woman who was really grieving cognitively and really grieving through her need to do something versus her emotions. And thus, because she wasn't grieving through emotions, it wasn't being recognized as grief. But if you listen to the messages that bereaved people often get, oh, he's in a better place. You'll get over this, or just give it time. And a lot of these messages are very well intended, but what they do say is, get on with it, pick yourself up. Oh, this is going to give you the aha. So now you say, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And now I'm fine, which is ridiculous, of course. But there's this real strong emphasis on dismissing grief and loss in our lives because we're supposed to be strong. I go back to the image of Jackie Kennedy after President Kennedy was shot, and the images of her, dressed in black with the black veil, completely stoic. And that became the role model for how we're supposed to do grief, right? There was so much admiration of how she, quote, handled her grief. To the extent that a lot of people feel that they're going nuts or they're going crazy, or they can't stand the fact that they've gone upstairs 5 times in a row and forgot completely each time what they went upstairs to get. That's a part of my daily life now. But, I think many people really experience a real sense of, I'm not normal. I don't know who I am right now. It goes back to that assumptive world, right? But it's really a piece of losing control, having a fear that I won't be able to handle what's coming at me, and people around me, telling me how I, quote, should be, and I'm doing my best. But underneath all of this is that sense of feeling powerless, feeling helpless, a lack of control, and being confused. And we don't have a paradigm for how to deal with these feelings well in our society and our social nets, right? Other pieces to keep in mind, we always think of grief as being an emotional experience. And for some people, it's more experienced physically. They might have body aches and pains. Very common to experience the same kind of symptoms as the person you loved who died. I had one client whose husband died of a sudden heart attack. She was a teacher, and she actually went to emerge twice with chest pain. And luckily, she encountered people who were very sensitive to her there and who understood. She was really struggling with this, but she'd never had heart disease or chest pain before. But of course, she went to seek help, and this was part of her grief. Socially, if you're not feeling yourself, if you're having troubles engaging well, it's really difficult to maintain social contact and connection with others. And sometimes the person who's bereaved pushes it away because they just don't feel normal, or it's too much work. And that's where, if you can be the presence, the person who's able to just be with, that's so much more valued because there's no expectation attached to that. We often don't think about the economic impact of grief as well. I've had 3 young widows have to declare bankruptcy after their husbands died suddenly. And so on top of their grief, on top of dealing with their children's grief, they also had collections agencies and all sorts of things happening that it was just overwhelming. And of course, that had feelings as well of, why didn't my husband have insurance? Why didn't he pay that insurance? Why didn't he, tell me we were in this type of financial situation? So if you got to think about, if you want to support people who are grieving, you got to think about, what's your goal. So if your goal is to help them to feel better, that's going to be frustrating, because you can't reverse time and you can't bring back a person who died. You can't undo what has happened now. So you might not be able to make somebody feel better, but you might be able to make a difference because you're present and available to them. And that's really much more important than helping them to feel better, because there's no aha, there's no magic word you're going to say that they're going to say, oh, I feel so much better now. Sometimes people think, well, the goal is so they can express their feelings, they can talk about how they feel. And that might be fine for somebody who really is grieving emotion, whose emotions are the primary focus. But let's say you really aren't grieving emotionally, or maybe the feelings that are arising are very different than what you expected. Maybe it's more anger than it is, sadness. Maybe it's more fear. So instead of assuming there's going to be feelings, listen for what's coming up, listen for what's already arising, and be present to that. And then maybe to help people, the goal would be to help them refer to functionality. And as we discussed just in the last slide, rushing grief really leads to what we call suppressed grief, grief that goes underground. It doesn't go away. What happens then is it becomes something that's like the black market. You don't talk about it. It's there. It's very active. And what happens is it'll tend to surface in ways that are very difficult when there's triggers around. And how it surfaces in other ways can be very painful and much more disruptive than the original way the grief was being expressed. So something I often will ask my clients when they'll come in, I have so many clients coming in saying, I just need to stop wallowing in this. I need you to help me get better. I've never been like this before. I turn it around, and the question I'll ask is, well, what's right about what's wrong? What's right about this grief? How much did you love this person while you're grieving because you love this person? How much energy did you spend with this person, on this person, in your relationship? Well, the grief is going to be very much similar to that. And sometimes the grief triggers into other types of losses that we're really not so aware of. So we might be surprised by experiencing so much grief over a loss that we didn't think was so significant, but maybe it's triggering into other losses that we maybe haven't had such awareness around. So to be with someone who's grieving, this is a lot of being present, a lot of listening, a lot less talking. This is where having a spiritual practice is so helpful, because understanding how to just sit and be with, understanding how to be open to what's arising versus trying to fix it or to do something. This is really hard when I'm giving talks to professionals and people who are clinicians and they don't have necessarily a spiritual practice. It's hard to explain how to be fully present. It's hard to explain what compassion really is, because they understand academic terms, they understand research, which thankfully the Compassionate Mind Foundation is putting out a lot of really great research that I can draw upon. But the really key component is that if you have a practice and you know what it's like to be grounded and you know what it's like to be fully present, this is really what you're doing, is you're being with someone who's in pain, who's really struggling, and you're being open to what's arising. So the focus on grief is about being with rather than doing to. Go back to, this is not something that you treat or intervene. It's something that you bear witness to. It's something that you acknowledge. It's something that you're fully present in as much of a loving way that you can be. Many people who grieve feel it's really helpful to do what we call remembering. You're putting back together pieces of your life that used to be. They're not going to fit back in the same way, just like the window pane. But I'll often, ask, people to tell their story. Sometimes people need to say the same story over and over again. And I think of it like we're walking around a sculpture together and we're seeing different parts of that sculpture. And this is part of the process of reorienting after a significant loss. Linking objects and pictures are often really helpful and comforting. If they've lost a loved one, using the name, talking about the person by their name is often very helpful. People will say, people will say, I know how uncomfortable others are around me. I won't melt. I'm not going to just crumble into a puddle. And even if I do, just find a bucket. I think some people don't raise up the name of a person or bring up memories of the person because they don't want to make it worse. And I can guarantee that the person's already on their mind. So go ahead, feel free to step in and do remembering, share stories, things that you remember, things you remember this person sharing, and be okay with that. So it's kind of the takeaway, supporting grief. You don't try to fix it. There's nothing to fix here, and you can't fix it anyway. So don't, if you hinge being able to feel like you've done a good job with somebody because they felt better, then you've got the wrong outcome here. The outcome here is not being attached to the outcome, but being fully involved in the presence and the process. So remember, there's no aha. There's nothing you're going to say that's going to make this better. So you don't try. And when you do try, often it's a dismissive comment and people shut down because they don't want to feel like they're disappointing you. Another piece with grief is that people often will suppress their grief or kind of clamp it down if they feel you're uncomfortable with it. You're uncomfortable with what they're feeling. So they can't afford more losses of people around them. So they've already had a significant loss that's affected their attachment system. So I don't want to be that person that makes you have to hide your grief. So don't give advice. If you find yourself saying, you should do this, you should do that, you might say, when I had this loss or I had a similar experience, this is what helped me. And they can choose whether or not to do it or not. Even with my clients, I don't give out homework. I don't tell them what they should do. I might make suggestions. And I have no expectation that they'll follow through. And if they do, they'll tell me. Cliches and trite statements, they're out there. They're so common. There's books written about them. Just be aware that you don't want to try to take somebody away from their grief if that's where they are. And it's easy to compare losses, but you really can't. And maybe it's apples and oranges. It's all fruit, but an apple tastes very different than an orange, than a grape, than a banana. So you're dealing with grief, which is the fruit, but the different flavors of the grief and the different types of losses, it's probably better not to try to compare. The one I hear the most is, I know just how you feel. I had this, blah, blah, blah. And people will listen to that, and I know it's meant well, but often that's experienced as, oh, you think I should do this, or, oh, you got over it and I'm not getting over it as fast. So just be careful. We don't want to perpetuate these shaming type of messages. I will, because of COVID and what's happening, I think we're going to see an increase in this particular type of grief, and I'm just putting it out there. Right now, we say this really debilitating type of complicated grief is about 8 to 10% of the population, 15% if you're looking at some of the other studies. I think this number is going to go up pretty fast now with looking at grief after the pandemic. So this is what we call complicated grief, prolonged grief disorder, persistent complex bereavement disorder. There's lots of different names for this particular type of grief. And it's a type of grief that's completely debilitating, that even after months after a major loss, it's as if it happened yesterday. And that's not necessarily a bad thing so much as what I focus on are functionality. Are you able to get through your day? Are you able to eat? Are you able to do what you need to do? And are you able to function pretty much at a very basic level? I ask people about their sleep, because sleep is highly related to this complicated kind of grief. And if people aren't getting, my ballpark figures, if you're not getting 4 or 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep at night, chances are you cannot process during the day. It's okay 1 or 2 nights, every few weeks, but if it's consistently this way, I'm going to suggest that you maybe talk to your doctor about getting some help with your sleep. We've seen people with this type of grief. There's a higher rate of suicide in people with this type of grief, a higher rate of what we call concurrent depression, which is a separate thing from grief. They're very different. Increased use of substances, compulsive behaviors, things that really interfere with the ability to engage in life. And worsening medical disorders. And this is where the increased morbidity and mortality rates come in with this particular type of grief. So to recognize this is really, I would say I wouldn't worry about this type of grief or this feeling of grief. The first few months, up to about 6 months, people do experience these. Sometimes you'll especially hear bereaved parents say, I don't know that I want to live. And those are passive sort of suicide wishes, and they're normal and common. But after several months of a person actually spiraling down worse, or they're really not functioning, I think it's time to help get them to some professional help and intervention. So we say complicating factors, and these are factors that maybe multiple losses, maybe no support system, maybe it's a death that happened very suddenly or under conditions that are really traumatic and difficult. We call disenfranchised grief, grief that's not recognized, grief that's not been socially acknowledged, and so the person doesn't have the kind of supports that they normally would need. Basic day-to-day functioning even after several months, or functioning worse. If they really start expressing active suicidality, they start talking about changing bank accounts, redoing their will, and you get a sense there's a pattern of behaviors, then I would start questioning, are you thinking of ending your life? Are you thinking of hurting yourself? Much better to be direct and ask the question than to be afraid to ask. It's not going to put it in their minds if it's already there. People who have a history of relational difficulties or really heavy dependence on the person who died are much more prone to developing this kind of complicated, debilitating grief. These are people we call having attachment disorders. But in layman's terminology, if you've noticed this person really has been heavily dependent on the other person, or can't cope, or they were so identified with the person who died that they don't really have a sense of identity, it's probably a good chance they would benefit from some intervention. And a rule of thumb is, being stuck. It's not that you have just triggers or flare-ups of the grief, but really being stuck in the grief after many, many months, or even when I see in my practice, people who have actually gotten worse over time, and instead of having a sort of lifting over time of the heavy oppressive parts of their grief. So this is the takeaway. If you're with somebody who's experiencing grief, different types of losses, normalize it. Say it. This is really hard. This is really hard. You can ask also, what would feel good to you right now? What would be helpful? Most of my bereaved clients will say, I have no idea. Then what I would respond is, okay, I'm here. Let's go and have a cup of tea, or let's just go watch the birds. It's about being fully present and sharing space more so than doing something. When you're listening, you don't need to necessarily compare. You don't want to interrupt. It's hard because you want to help. Our part of us that really wants to help others, that comes out. It's a good part of us, but sometimes it's a little bit overactive, and we need to say, let's just wait for this. I'm just going to be here and listen. And we validate the grief. The grief is what the person says it is, not what I assume it's going to be. It's not worse if I think it's supposed to be worse, and it's not less if the person is describing it to be as significant. And really mention these social rules. They really cause stigma and shame that's unnecessary to already a very painful time. So, who came up with that? Who came up with the idea that grief only lasts this long? Who says we don't grieve our pets? Some people grieve pets more than they did when their mother or their grandmother died. Grief is what you say it is, and I'm here in this grieving process. And there's my email. I would welcome if anybody would like to be in touch or has further things they'd like to ask. Feel free to send me an email, and I'd be glad to engage in a bit of dialogue. So I'm going to stop sharing. There we go, and go back. So that was grief in a nutshell.
Wow, Darcy, that was great. It was really great. So I'm an academic, so I really related to the way you did that. But I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to kick off with, if you don't mind. I'll just throw these two questions out and you deal with them however you want. One has to do with a little bit, you talked about people with a spiritual practice dealing with others. I was thinking about people with a spiritual practice dealing with themselves sitting. So that's one question. And what was my other question? Just a second now. Oh, baloney. Age related. If I think of it, I'll bring it up again.
Okay, please do. It's interesting, Mark, that a spiritual practice can complicate grief. I'm sure that's not surprising to anybody here, because in our spiritual practice, I think we also inadvertently put expectations on ourselves, that because I practice, I should be able to do this, or I should be able to have perspective, or, I should have embraced impermanence and can handle this with equanimity. And that's all striving, so I think the goal of practice and the work of practice is to be with what is arising. And if grief is what is arising, then we are with grief. There's no sense of should that really helps us in this process. It's more, what can I learn from this process? I identify with the pain of the universe. I identify with the pain of the human condition and all sentient beings. So to me, the true spiritual practice isn't about doing it differently. It's about being with it skillfully. Is that helpful?
Oh, yeah, that was wonderful. I did remember the other question, and it has to do with, so when we think about grief and we think about people dying, apart from that, in COVID, even if you knew no one who has died, COVID has been a huge grieving process, I think, because we've been unable to live our lives. You want to say anything about that? Have you encountered that in your practice?
I actually, one of the most common talks I'm asked to give right now is grieving the loss of living our lives. And I actually go to compassion-focused therapy. I don't know if you're familiar with it. This is Paul Gilbert's work. Roshi Joan Halifax does her work. They're very similar. They're very, but because I'm an academic, I tend to relate very well to Paul's work. But he looks at what he calls the emotion regulation system, and it's built into us. We have the threat system, which is to protect us and keep us safe. We have the drive system that helps us to make sure we get what we need and we do what has to be done. And then we have our soothing system, which is the rest and digest system. And that's the system that allows us to reflect, that allows us to balance out these other things so that we can make choices about how we want to be versus reacting, because we can't control what's coming at us, so all of us are dealing with this very differently. So what I like about this is I can kind of look and see compassionately where this is hitting me and hitting other people. So I always use the picture of the guy coming out of Costco with his cart loaded with toilet paper and Lysol and paper towels, and everybody mumbling and grumbling. What's this guy doing? Hoarding. That's his drive system, and he doesn't even probably consciously know why he's doing this. You get a dopamine hit when you do this, right? It's neurochemically involved, right? But in my threat system, that there's not going to be enough, I recognize his drive system acting out that I'm getting what I need, And my soothing system, if I can, and this is where practice does come in, that in my soothing system, I can look compassionately at this guy who's hoarding. I can look compassionately at these people who are in their threat mode and doing what they're doing politically, because I can, in my practice, bring myself back to this rest and digest and have the ability to look more broadly, and maybe have the ability to look more compassionately at myself. So I laugh, everybody talks about the COVID-10, how many of us were baking bread? I hadn't baked bread in 20 years. I'm baking bread, I'm making cakes, I'm making gravy sauces with, carrots and stuff. And then of course the clothes are fitting a little tight. It's easy to go into the shame piece of, oh my God, I'm letting myself just go. And then, that voice came up and said, this really isn't how you've been practicing for the last few years. And I realized the compassionate part was, I'm doing my best in the midst of a very difficult situation. This is really hard, and so it allowed me to address those things with myself, and the loss of being able to see my family, the loss of in Canada, we have universal health care. And what that's meant that in order to preserve our healthcare system, we've had to go in lockdown repeatedly to prevent that healthcare system from being completely overwhelmed so that the people who really need care get care. So this is at a time when there's health issues in my own family and the anxiety that comes around that. So the lots of losses, and it's more of it's how can I be with these experiences compassionately, knowing that I'm human, compassionately recognizing the humanity in all of us. And then knowing that we are grieving. This is part of the grief experiences. All these reactions are part of it. Are there other questions or anything anybody else would like to bring up? This is a lovely chance to also talk about something that we often don't talk about is, these loss experiences that we've had while we've been, in this pandemic, and looking at the news and seeing all the things that are happening.
Yes, I just wanted to mention, earlier today, I was looking at the subject of what we were going to talk about today, and I thought, why do we Buddhists spend so much time thinking about grief? And you really answered the question for me. I mean, I'm not a long practitioner, but now I know.
Well, you're in for a treat, because in a few weeks when Brad comes in, he can really address this stuff, very much from the Dharma. And that's what I said to Mark is, okay, I don't have a Raksu, I'm not somebody who's been in practice for 30 years, but my practice is there, and it helps me to choose how I want to be with all of this. And I think we really, death and grief and loss, I think they're right at the edge of our most vulnerable human experience, of the places where we really have to sit down and be with these things, because there's no cognitive answer. We can't figure this out. There's nothing we can, quote, do. So how do I be with this? And that's where my practice has been helpful.
I have a question. First of all, I'm going to get a hold of you about the political grieving. That really intrigues me a lot. And with the group, I work with social change agents, and so. But if there was one thing that you wanted, that you really, really wanted people to know who were finding themselves in sort of long-term grief, what would that be? If you could give someone a gem.
You're not alone. And don't be afraid of your pain. And let this work in you what it needs to work in you.
Thank you.
I want to say, Darcy, that I found this enormously helpful on so many levels. I was so glad you went over the things that in the past, how we thought about grief. And I can see how I have responded to other people with their grief and myself with my own grief, based on old rules and old thinking. And so it was just really, really helpful to me, and very comforting to hear you talk about the grief in terms of our, not just the personal losses, which we had this year, along with everything else. That it was so helpful to hear you talk about the grief politically, and of course, COVID and the grief I feel often for our earth. And so there's so many levels of grief and so much we're carrying this year. Thank you so much.
What a beautiful heart, Robin, to carry, the love of the world, to carry compassion for the world and for others, no matter if they agree with you or not, to share that love. It's beautiful and painful at the same time, right? I think if we're open to feeling that love and compassion, we're also open to the pain that comes with it. So this is a beautiful heart that I see. Thank you. Mark
Hi,
actually has his
Darcy.
actual hand raised, so I guess this is Pat. Hi.
Hi, Darcy. I worked in hospice for many, many years, and we dealt with the concept anticipatory grief. Can you comment on that?
Yes. So in my work and research with non-death loss, what I've kind of come to is that anticipatory grief is more about the losses that lead to the loss. That most people, it's not necessarily the grieving the loss that's about to come, but grieving the loss of today, that today he can't recognize me, or today I can't get him up, or I can't help her to do something, or today she stopped eating. So the anticipatory grief is a separate type. It's grief of the losses along the way, I think, more so than anticipating the big loss. And I think one of my clients, when I used to work in palliative care and hospice care as a nurse, would talk about the litany of the day. I don't know what it's going to be. What's today going to do? What loss is it going to be today? And what's important about that is to know that that doesn't have any effect on the grief that you experience after the death of a loved one, even a palliative loss. That these losses along the way, they're like little hits, they're just little arrows that go in, and sometimes they're bigger arrows and bigger arrows. For a really long-term experience with someone who's had a very long, drawn-out illness, the actual death might feel, one of my clients described it like a puff of smoke. She said, the fire's been going this whole time, and now he died. And she said, I just feel tired. But the type of grief that happens, before a death, you're anticipating the death, but you're also anticipating the losses that are happening along the way. And I think it's important to recognize these losses. One of the biggest experiences that I work with is people who have loved ones with dementia or Alzheimer's, and that loss of remembering, that loss of recognizing your children's names or your grandchildren's names, and I see them. They'll get their pictures. Don't you remember, Grandpa? This is so and so, and I'm your daughter. I'm such and such, and you see the anxiety that creates, because what this really is not about the person with the dementia. It's about your grief of not seeing yourself reflected back from that person's eyes the way, with knowing and love the way they used to, because they've lost that ability. That's your grief coming up, right? And so those are places where we work and say, who's dealing with what loss at this point in time, and what's the need? The need is to acknowledge that grief of not being able to see yourself reflected through your parents' eyes anymore, or their inability to know your name. And that's a huge grief, right? A huge loss for many people.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Pat. I hope that's helpful. I see Rita and Shervin. I don't know who put their hand up first, but whoever, thank you. Shervin, you whichever one, you need to unmute yourselves.
Okay, I'll go first.
Thank you.
One of the things that this brought up for me was kind of remembering if we get back out in the world again. I was thinking some people will be expressing their grief and irritability and short-temperedness. And since I get triggered by that, with a complete stranger, is for me to remember that I don't know what they've been through. And to, carry that out and try to be patient and not reactionary with people in the world, because so many people have had, I mean, everybody's had grief at some level. It's none of us have escaped it. So just a kind of word for myself to, be gentle.
It's hard, and it comes from a good place, Rita. I think we see people who do more harm to others and who do more harm around them, and I feel protective of that. I feel protective of the world. I feel protective of people who are vulnerable, and at the same time, because the anger is really out there, the frustration, the cynicism, we don't see the vulnerability below it. But often anger and frustration and cynicism, they're up there like the dog with its back up, but it's hiding its vulnerable underbelly. So one of the things in my own work, I say, may I see the pain below the surface? May I see the hurt that doesn't get addressed? May I be an instrument to maybe open to that versus to make it get bigger? We talked a minute ago about the political grief. That's been my question really for the last 5 years, is how can I be an instrument without inflating things, without inflaming things, without making it worse? And I think it's a huge piece, but can I see our common humanity? Can I see what's below the surface? Not so figure them out, but so that I can be more fully present to what's there. Shuping, I think you have your hand up. Oh, you are muted.
Oh.
There you go. Okay.
Darcy, thank you for your talk. Yeah, actually, Pat's question just helped me to answer my first question. It's about, I think last year I was with my mom at her last month. And yeah, in your answer, yeah, that was difficult part. But because the nursing background helped me to went through that. And actually it hit me bad this year at the same time for almost a month. I just feel like there's no energy.
Mm-hmm.
And during your talk actually helped me to realize maybe that's my part of a grieving process to react to. Thank you for that.
So thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my second question is that, yeah, we know when you kind of bearing the grieving, when not happen to you, but you listen to other people. At the beginning, probably easy, you know what's going on. But when it comes to the root, as a listener, how are you going to support, but not being just step in telling what to do when you see they are going down again and it's very harmful? That's my question.
I'm laughing because I know Pat, Mark, and Shuping. So I was trained originally in nursing and in medicine, health sciences. So it's a very proactive model. You evaluate and assess. You plan your intervention. You do an intervention, and then you reassess at the end. It's about a lot of doing. So grief is one of those places where you have to sort of recognize that's what you've been trained, and that may not serve you, or it may. You kind of have to go with that. For a client that I feel is dealing with this real debilitating type of grief process where they're not functioning, where I'm concerned that they may take their lives, or I'm concerned about harm happening to them over the long run, I will come right out and say, I'm very concerned about this. And I feel that this might be useful to, and I'll call in depending upon what the issue is, to their family doctor, a referral, to some, and I'll be pretty direct with that in a most compassionate way, not to say you're doing it all wrong or you should be over this by now, but to say, I feel concerned for you and I care about you. And I think this might be a place where we need other help to come in. And that's where I would kind of, that's how I gently would move people in the direction. I'm also aware of the limitations of what's out there. And so I have to keep in mind what am I going to suggest. So if I suggest they go to a family doctor who really has not had training about differentiating grief and depression or complicated grief, I might need to be the backup person to help fill out the details with that person's experience. Medication use and grief often don't go well together unless there's an underlying depression or an underlying background of history. So you have to be careful with that. But if they're having what we call the vegetative signs of sleep deprivation and inability to function, those are hitting the same neurochemical markers as depression might. So those are things that might respond to medication and other things would not. So I did have a client, this was the same client that grieved in her head. She was very academically oriented and she really did not like being out of control with her feelings. And for her to be triggered in public or triggered in her workplace and to you know, cry and to not be able to pull herself, as she called it, together was really a traumatic experience for her. She recounted her husband, all their family lived in Ohio, so she had to cross the border to go see them for Thanksgiving. And she said it was the weirdest thing. She said she drove up to the kiosk for the customs, you know, the border official, and he said, "Where are you going?" And she told him, and he said, "Why are you going there?" And she looked at him and she said, "I've never done this." I burst into tears. She said, "I completely lost myself." And she said, "He waved me through really fast." And she said, "I've learned that's a good way to get through the border." but for her, that was traumatizing, you know, the fact that she's not used to being this way. And so for her, she did go on medication because it helped her to feel like she had more control over her feelings. And she came to see me regularly to kind of work through some of the other stuff with the grief. So I don't know if that's helpful, Shuping. I might have gone off on a tangent. So thank you.
Darcy, thank you so much for your wonderful talk this morning. Sincerely appreciated it.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Darcy. And please say hello to Brad. We'll see him in a couple of weeks.
That's right. You'll get to see him in a couple of weeks. So very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, Robin.
Bye,
Bye, Tatiana.
everyone.
Bye, everybody. Bye, Mark. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.